Hey guys, first regardsman here, and so I'll be talking about year 2 of Space Marine 2 and how this year of content actually saved the game. And to talk about this with me, I have brought on Jefficus. Now Jeff, we have been talking about Space Marine 2 pretty much since it came out. The game has changed a ton, and year 2 was by far the biggest year. And how do you feel about the current state of just the content drops?
I am pretty satisfied, honestly. We look back at what got added in year two, and we've gotten heroic weapons. We've gotten four new operations. We've gotten effectively two to three new bosses at this point, with the winged primes, the mutilith vortex beast, and now the Terminator sorcerer. We have gotten a lot of content. Oh, and a new class. We got the tech marine, and a good look into kind of what class design is going to look like in 2027 whenever we get the next class. So I am extremely content, extremely happy with the volume of content that has been released for Space Marine 2, especially considering that their only way to monetize the game is two DLCs, two cosmetic DLC packs, pretty much. Everything else that you can get is all earnable in the game, and they have not yet fully gone through with implementing something like microtransactions for the game.
The year 2 has been significantly better for the player base than year 1 was. Now, we look back at year 1, we got two secondaries, we got like one of the worst operations in the entire game with Obelisk. We also got a pretty good one with Exfiltration, and we also got one new boss in that year. We got the Siege mode and the Prestige grind, and it's like some weapons were swapped among different classes. So most of year 1 was really Saber kind of locking down the fundamental game modes that we are now expanding upon in year 2. And I think year 2 is really when the game hit its stride. After Siege mode, a lot of players are like, what could possibly be next for this game? But like you said, the consumer friendly model for their DLC pricings has been a huge boon for like new players to come to the game and not have to deal with like a huge paywall. And also year 2 just dropped way more substantial content unlocks with stuff like heroic weapons and things like superior balancing on the weapons that exist in the game already. As far as how I feel about the 2 years, year 2 was just way more entertaining to play. Year 1 really felt like the game had no idea what it was doing in terms of balance until like the very end. And year 2, the heroic weapons, I think that was like the single biggest thing for player retention. And this game is now bigger than it's pretty much ever been in the year 1 of content outside of the initial launch and like the lethal drop.
Yeah, I know that accolades are a little bit of a controversial subject because they're doing things like adding accolades over to PvP to encourage players to play that. But at the same time, accolades themselves as a system has gotten more players to play the game more regularly. People are interested in logging in, completing some stratagems, completing the weeklies, etc., earning accolades so that they could buy cosmetics that are available for them to purchase, some in-game goodies. Basically, a form of progression for you to continue to make your character more visually appealing or to get things from your favorite chapters, such as the Wolfguard helmet or soon some of the Deathwatch cosmetics, and apply them to your character if you don't want to, shove out the money for it. But one of my favorite questions to get is, Jeff, what DLC should I buy? Should I buy the DLC for Space Marine 2? And I pretty much always respond like, hey, like what is your favorite Space Marine chapter? Just buy that one. Like just pick that one up. You don't need to buy the entire pack of all these other skins that you're never going to use if you don't like those chapters, if you're not a fan of other Space Marines. And I think that the this model is pretty much the core, the sole, not the sole reason, but the main reason why Space Marine 2 is so successful is because we have this amazing, replayable 40k co-op horde game that is not trying to nickel and dime you left and right. It's just, hey, we're going to keep making content for this game, even if you just bought the original game at no cost to you. We're just going to release it all for you to play and experience for free.
A lot of players have also asked about like what is the end game grind for Space Marine 2, and in the case of year 2 and beyond, It really is the accolades grind, these hard stratagems, the weeklies in siege mode, the new PvP accolades are going to be added into like patch 14 and beyond. The cross progression for the endgame grind, that is pretty much what players are supposed to be doing. Like once you level up your classes and as we get further into the game, there will be more and more heroic weapons for you to unlock, and the amount of accolades you'll require to unlock everything in the game, including those heroic cosmetics like the Wolfguard helmet you mentioned, it will be a tremendous amount. So really, they're
Oh yeah.
locking in like your grind in Space Marine 2 once level up. It is these accolades, and those accolades have kept players around. And I think the stratagems and the weekly grind has been a really good thing for the game. I know players complain about this, but companies don't do this if it didn't work. Excuse me, they would not do this if it did not work. The thing is that companies know that even if players complain, they have the numbers on player retention, and if players were not coming back, they would change something. People ask all the time, why is there a 1,000 accolades cap in Space Marine 2? It's because they don't want you to be able to buy every single heroic item the moment it drops in a new patch of like 6 new weapons.
Additionally, Space Marine 2 is a live service game. A lot of people try to kind of ignore that fact, but it really is, considering the amount of content that we get on a pretty regular basis and the annual monetization that we have of the game. And we will probably see Saber loosen up on accolades as we get closer to Space Marine 3. They're going to throw basically all the loot in the game at us so that people, and probably XP and everything, right? As we get closer to Space Marine 3, because they would want people to be able to experience as much of Space Marine 2 as they possibly can before moving on to the sequel.
I would say in the case of them like loosening up on accolades, we do kind of see that in the community events. We see them adding more options to obtain accolades, and especially once we approach Space Marine 3, like you said, they will probably just dump these community events out all the time. They give you more
Oh, yeah.
options, maybe buff up the total cap, because we'll have to see when Space Marine 3 officially launches, but Space Marine 3's launch might be less substantial than the current content in Space Marine 2 after 3 to 4 years, and because of that, I would imagine that the accolades grind will still be a huge portion of the main content drops for this game. As far as my overall feelings on how year 2 has saved Space Marine 2, I think the game was actually in a pretty bad spot at the end of year 1. There was a point in time when I was making content for the game where I was like, if there's no year 2 content, there's just nothing substantial here that is super fun to play. I mean, we knew there was gonna be post-launch content just because of like World War Z, but in the case of a live service game, which this one is, I see a lot of people say it's not, but when the initial creative director or the initial CEO of Saber said that it's not live service, we're talking about nickel and diming the player. Not saying there's gonna be no post-launch support. They're mentioning them not trying to take the money from the player base with microtransactions, because live service games have a negative connotation in the Big 26, and because of that they want to stay away from that title, but it still has all that post-launch support. And I was a bit worried for a while that year 1 was just going to be the end of like a proper content drops, and even some of the focus community managers themselves said like it's normal for a game to stop content drops over time. But in the case of year 2, I think year 2 probably overperformed from where Saber was initially expecting it to be, because there was a moment where the focus community managers said they'll have to wait and see how the Tech Marine does before they decide to make a new class or not. And we now have confirmation there is a new class coming, so I suspect that year 2 dramatically overperformed from their expectations, just like the initial launch of the game.
Well, not only that, but they had to release Tech Marine to really get that data and see how many people are actually going to come back to the game because of this. And when they released both the Tech Marine and the Ultra Grinds, we saw this massive spike in returning players come back to try the game and new players to try the game for the first time. And this is something that we see with other games as well. For example, with Dark Tide, they recently had the Skitarii release for the game, basically an Adeptus Mechanicus playable class. And this is like the first time that you can play as an Adeptus Mechanicus themed character in first person, so it's a big deal. So these releases for us Warhammer 40k fans are a massive deal, and being able to play as something like the Tech Marine, and soon, probably the Chaplain if the leaks are correct, spoiler alert, this is pretty massive for people who are big 40k fans like myself. And Saber recognized this success, and they recognized that there was so much support in this community when they basically started to have to decline other projects because they were working on Space Marine 2 and Space Marine 3. Their teams are busy. Like their teams are busy and focused on capitalizing on this setting, on Warhammer 40K in general. And as a fan, I don't mind. I love it. I love that we're just going to continue to see more and more content get released for this game and get produced for the future and future games.
That is true. They said this game was a huge boon for their company. It was the most successful game in Saber's history, and Saber is a 25-year-old company, so that's a pretty long resume for them to finally just like pop out their banger 25 years later. And they did recently come out, like you said, and they mentioned that they have denied and declined other major IPs because they are focused on Warhammer. Warhammer 40K, Space Marine 3 is probably going to be their most ambitious project ever. I think Space Marine 2 is where they're testing out a lot of that. I think the content in Space Marine 2, a lot of this post-launch content is actually better than what we had in the original game. I think we should expect a similar quality in the Space Marine 3 when that comes out. And more importantly, I think the content drops for Space Marine 3 will be far more substantial. Now, the big question is monetization. We bring this up all the time, but they know that the player base in Space Marine 2 will like guaranteed move over to Space Marine 3 on top of the Warhammer 40K audience. There's like absolutely no way the players who are dedicated to Space Marine 2 right now will not jump ship immediately to just like try out the new game. They might come back if it's like a Payday 3 situation, but either way, they know that like Space Marine 2 was like their initial boon, and Space Marine 3 is their big shot to truly capitalize on that major cash flow. I've seen a lot of players bring up that, you know, why is Saber abandoning Space Marine 2, or like why are they moving on from Space Marine 2 for Space Marine 3? They should have made this game the best it could possibly be. I think in this case, not they're abandoning Space Marine 2, like they still have their post-launch content, but Space Marine 3, they had that massive cash flow from Space Marine 2's success, and they want to make a game with a greater scale, because if you have like Space Marine 2 and just try to like, you know, take what this game is at its core mechanics, it's broken in a lot of ways, and I think fixing those up for a new game and then having far more substantial content drops, that'll probably be better for like the entire player base.
Yeah, and my hope, just judging by the content drops that we're getting here in year 2 and the content that we've kind of been given a sneak peek of in year 3, my hope is that Saber recognizes what players are actually looking for, especially considering that we now have experience, right? They now have experience with what we want to see in the game. We've been asking them for about 2 years at this point for a lot of very specific things, like, hey, we want a new enemy faction, we want more weapons, we want more build variety for our characters. Hey, these perks seem kind of busted, these seem pretty integral to pretty much every single build, can you change these? Hey, these mechanics are busted, or these enemies are overtuned. Like, they now understand how to design enemies better, how to design levels and missions better. They understand probably that operations are significantly more popular than PvP or Siege. They were probably, when they designed Space Marine 2, they were probably anticipating that more people were going to participate in PvP than in the PvE side of the game. And the only data that I have to back that up is that Space Marine 1 had a bigger PvP scene than a PvE scene, because the PvE in that game was kind of very watered down. It's more of like a scoreboard, you know, kind of mini game type thing, little horde mode. But in Space Marine 2, it is a entirely different thing. It's completely fleshed out, and for the most part, like, I don't think anyone could have really predicted that the operations game mode and now stratagems would have taken off as much as they have for Space Marine 2. It's pretty much the backbone of the community, and year 2 has done a lot to show that there's a lot of meat here. And if Space Marine 3 is designed with that focus in mind, dude, Space Marine 3 is going to be just fine.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point there on the operations being bigger than they originally expected. I think that is probably true. I think operations is like the die-hard mode of the player base for this game. Like even when they drop new content drops for siege mode, I presume even with the new chaos siege mode, players always go back to ops. They just like running like a 30-minute, 20-minute mission sometimes and just using their new build, using their new weapon, dressing up their character, and then just like going back to work or just going to to bed or something with their kids, because a lot of gamer dads who play this game. But more importantly, do you think that there will be a stratagems operations mode in right off the bat in Space Marine 3? Like, do you think that's going to be something they're going to add immediately? Because we didn't get stratagems until year 2 in this game with the heroic weapons. But I feel like given the success of year 2 and the heroic grind and accolades, they're probably going to implement a system like that immediately. And if they don't, I think that's a pretty massive misstep. I don't know how players would feel about waiting an extra year or like even more potentially to get the grind or like just, the heroic unlocks for new weapons that we already have in this game.
I think they'll probably try to do a 2.0 or reinvention of the system. Mostly because they wouldn't want players to identify right away, like, oh, geez, we got to do dailies and weeklies again, guys. Like, here we go. Like, they're probably going to reinvent the system in some way, keep the grind intact, because they know that, deep down, for whatever reason, humans yearn for the mines. We yearn for the grind. And we will log into a game and kill, 1,000 filthy Xenos and heretics in order to get a gun or a sword that is a higher rarity. And they'll probably reinvent the system, dude. It'll probably be like kind of a continuation of like armory data, but now you're going to be able to find pink quality armory data, and that's how you're going to ascend the weapons in Space Marine 3 and all that stuff. I don't think it's going to be a one-for-one kind of copy of the accolades system.
I think you actually bring up a really good point there, that if they drop Space Marine 3 with a weekly grind, the initial player reaction will be incredibly negative. If they wait like 6 to 12 months to then drop in a weekly system for the dedicated player base, just like we saw with this game, and players would be far more receptive to that. And it does make me wonder, like, this is just pure tinfoil hat from me. I would love to see like randomization in drops for weapons and stuff like that in Space Marine 2, or excuse me, Space Marine 3. I think that'd be a really cool system to have for at least like one game mode. But I think what they've kind of fumbled on a bit in Space Marine 2 was not having enough cross progression immediately. They are trying to like rectify that with the accolades grind in the siege mode in patch 13 and now the upcoming patch 14 PvP mode. But I think Space Marine 3 really needs to launch with like a proper cross progression for all players in all game modes and give players something to properly work for, as not feel monotonous, because that was something Space Marine 2 was severely limited in on its initial launch, and that's something they rectified a lot in year 2. But that is pretty much all I have to say in this one. Let's get some final thoughts. But, I think this game is in a phenomenal spot right now, and year 3 will probably be even better for the player base.
The last thing that I have to say, and this is something that the community did, not necessarily the developers, but whenever Saber and Focus released those DLC heads, I thought that the community would just bend over, just buy the product, just consume, and kind of move on with their day. But I was very impressed that this community showed that it's not going to sit there and basically be sold slop. It's not going to be sold garbage. And when the community rallied together and basically told Saber and Focus, like, no, 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 this is not acceptable. Having a price tag on this is utterly ridiculous. I was extremely happy that this community showed that it's got backbone. And that is something that I think is going to carry forward into year 3 and into Space Marine 3. And that is going to help us get great content. Basically just not accepting slup. So
I think that's
really
the
happy
Warhammer
that
40k community in a lot of cases in general that will like really stand out to be like, well, we hate this like new model release and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that Saber handled that pretty damn well, and I'm also pretty proud of Space Marine 2's community. It's a pretty chill community. In a lot of games I've played, they've been pretty toxic over time, but this one has stayed pretty good, even as it's gotten more and more into its dedicated portion. But that is all we have to talk about in this one, guys. If you have not subscribed to Jefficus, you should check out his channel in the description below, or just like click on the little like collab icon. And if you're not subbed to me, you should definitely do that. And as always, thank you for watching. Take it easy. Bye.
The Emperor protects.